Hey, it's Warren Hewitt here. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm sitting here with the great Joe Chiccarelli. How are you, my friend?
Pleasure to be here. I'm always here. You're
I
here.
I know. We've done lots of things from Sunset. I'm sort of here on and off all the time, but whenever I'm here, you're here.
We see each other in the hallway and in the courtyard all the time.
And we, of
Yeah,
course,
this has definitely been like a second home for me for the last 10 years.
it's been that long.
Yeah, it's just about 10 years, I think. I've kind of camped out here in Studio One. It's all the rooms here are great and kind of classic sounding, but something about this room, between the sound of the console and the sound of the tracking room, I've just fallen in love with. I think maybe I'd worked here in the 90s, but late mid 2000s, I did an album with a British artist called Mika. Had a big pop single called Grace Kelly, and we tracked it here. And I hadn't tracked in this room in maybe 5, 10 years prior to that, and it was just so much fun tracking in this room. So easy getting drum sounds that I just was sort of like, I don't know if I have to move any place else in the city.
It's
I mean,
amazing.
I certainly work at East West. I love East West and Village and Capitol and Ocean Way, but I don't know, something about this room, just the fatness of this old custom built analog Domidio API console is fantastic, and this tracking room. So it's been home for 10 years.
And it's so well run.
It's very well run. Everything works. The staff is fantastic. People have just got good spirits.
Mhm.
Like you want to be in a place that people like coming to their job. You know, people are excited to be working in the studio, and the assistants are that way, and everybody's just real positive. It's good.
This I was thinking about this the other day because I speak so fondly of Sunset as well. Sunset's like Italy to me because when you go to Italy, you see these beautiful women and their style, and you see this architecture, and it seems like there's this conscious, nothing changed. It's like you see the Roman Empire, you see the art, the evolution, where a lot of studios I love, if they're older, they've been remodeled.
Yes,
They've been tried to be modernized. This just feels like the history from when it was started off doing like Disney records through obviously the great period of Bruce Botnik being here with the Doors and Love and all those great records, and then the 70s was the Stones and Zeppelin, and basically it just feels like a continuation.
Yep. Absolutely.
So it's seeped in it, everything.
I'm laughing because I did something recently. Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols and I have been doing this live broadcast from here for KLOS Radio. And Steve was really funny that every time he comes in the building, he's sort of like, it smells like the 70s in here. And it does.
Yeah.
It's just something about it that's just historic. Absolutely.
I mean, every era has been a great record.
Yeah, I mean, really.
80s, you had Prince.
Van Halen, Prince. After 90s was Beck, Sheryl Crow. I mean, really, it's just some of the classics. And for me, when I bring bands in here, what's great about it is when they know the history and they see photographs of people standing in the same spot that they're standing doing a lead vocal. They see Mick and Keith standing in the middle of the room doing a vocal, and they know they're in that same spot. Or the drummer sees that he's in the same spot as all the Doors sessions or the Buffalo Springfield sessions. Everybody, I think, feels like they sort of have to up their game and really be at their best. It's beautiful. It's very, very inspirational to know that you're kind of part of that legacy.
But one of the first, I understand entirely. One of the first things we did when I came in here with an artist once is he played, You Really Got Me. We panned the guitar to one side. We took the chamber and painted it to the other side and just went, and he's like, oh, Van Halen. It was like, so for him, it was just amazing. So every era is covered.
Yep.
I mean, for me, obviously, being a fan of great engineers, anything Botnik did, especially
fantastic,
forever changes.
For all Soft Parade, I used to listen to incessantly because just the clarity and the smoothness, but yet it still rocked. I don't know how he did it. I mean, the one thing when I first came here, I saw these pictures of him using Sony C37A tube mics on drum overheads and acoustic guitars and things like that. So I've adopted that just because I loved his sound so much. And there is a warmth and character to those mics, but ultimately it's the room. The console has changed over 30, 40 years, but that room just has a very special character.
Absolutely. I think Bruce's sensitivity to phase is just must be second to none, because his drums, you put on like a track like Peace Frog, it's the drums just sit there perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of records, due to the limitations of the day, tend to sound like, oh, it's either one mic crushed or whatever it is, but it doesn't have that space around it.
Right.
But you listen to Peace Frog and listen to the drum sounds, and then you put on something like the Stone Roses, where you can tell they were listening to that track in particular for those kind of grooves. And you're like, it could almost be the same era.
Yeah.
His drum sounds for me just sound so modern, and I mean that in a positive way, like super in phase, super
absolutely
slamming,
no.
like
and the punch that they got with, I would think it was maximum a 4-mic setup on that stuff. It was amazing. I mean, I fight to get toms that present with 15 mics.
I have no idea how to do it.
Yeah, it's great.
Between him and Glyn Johns, there must have been some tape measures out or something.
Yeah, well, Glyn is just transcendent in a lot of ways. I don't know. It's always interesting when you go visit somebody else in their session, another producer, another engineer, and you see their technique. And you're like, how do they get something sounding that great with the technique that they're using? Because to me, that particular approach doesn't make any sense. Absolutely. And you see Glyn work, and it's very minimal, but it sounds amazing. And there's something about his mic placement, his sense of balance, that he can make something sound 5 different ways with a very simple approach. I got to patch in 13 microphones, 14 compressors, et cetera, to take something to the left or to the right or whatever. And he just has this ability via balance or mic choice to just go, oh, okay, all right, here's this approach. Oh, here's this approach. And you're like, he's just so gifted.
I agree, he's incredibly gifted, but my hat's off to you. I mean, like Jack and I are always talking. It's like we're huge fans of the way your records sound.
That's very kind. I just, it's a every day is a puzzle. Every day is a mystery. I just hope one of these days I get it right.
Wow, you get it right a lot.
No, it's always, you're always sort of. But that's looking to improve, or I mean, there's that, I think, in every human being. But I think that for me, it's about capturing who the artist is, what the song is all about, and it's about just diving into their world and blowing it up and making it better and making it as big and strong, as impressive and as exciting as it can be, so it's I don't know, it's almost certainly it's a service industry in ways.
Sure.
And you're really serving the core of the song. And I don't know, for me, I find the more I can kind of surrender to that, give in and give to that, the easier it is to make a better record. But there's some days that you don't quite understand the song or don't quite understand the artist or whatever it is, that it is like this sort of puzzle of pushing things in place and trying to make it all fit together. And so it is the challenge and the fun of the job, that every day is a mystery, and every day is like, how am I going to solve this puzzle? How am I going to take this idea of this artist or this concept or this bunch of musicians and make it all work together? So it kind of keeps it fresh.
Absolutely. Well, the one common denominator between all great people that I know or admire is that constant need to learn and the enjoyment factor of it as well, loving what you do and wishing to push the boundaries the whole time. I can't imagine anybody resting on their laurels and making greatness.
No, it would be nice if you could
Yeah,
just take a
exactly.
little break and make it all easy, but no, it's never easy.
Well, what
me.
I love is all of my friends, my musician friends,
Yeah.
always say their favorite records that they've made are with you. So
Oh man,
that's a great one.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So that's good, especially when you're talking like the LA scene, because we all know these same players, and they're all phenomenal players. One thing that's interesting, and just as a total tangent, which I'm famous for, of course, my tangents, is what I love about the great musicians. And I saw, just last week when I was here and you were here, Matt Chamberlain's playing with you on this record.
Roger Manning,
of course, is phenomenal. And of course, Victor Andrizzo, who I use as well, and you use. Great drummer. The thing about those guys, and I think it's an interesting sideline, is a lot of musicians probably need to know that what's great about these players is they sound like they're in the band.
Yes.
That's an interesting one to understand, because I get guys pitching me all the time. They send me their demos, their videos, and they're showing me all their incredible technique, which is fantastic. But when you've got so you're working, what's the singer you're working with?
I'm working with Jamie Lawson, who is a UK artist, been very successful there. Really great voice, really great songs, just beautiful storytelling, emotional, sometimes dark, but really strong tunes. Been an absolute pleasure. But that's really a good point you make, because it's really about being invisible.
Right.
Matt Chamberlain and Roger Manning and Victor and Sean Hurley and Dave Levita, Tim Pierce. There's so many great players in this town. We're really fortunate here. And somebody will say, how'd you get that guitar sound? It's amazing. And it's like, it's Tim Pierce.
Yeah, exactly.
It's in his hands. It's in his sensibility. It's his choice of what he's doing, what sound he's choosing, how he's playing it, where he's playing it on the beat that really makes it sound great in the track. It's nothing that I did, but I think it's that thing of understanding the artist, becoming the artist, doing what's right for their music. With this Jamie Lawson project, it's been interesting because, in a sense, he writes very traditional songs, let's just say in the go back historically in the James Taylor, Paul Simon tradition. But of course, everybody wants to live in their times and make records that serve the time. So you want to modernize things in a way, but you want to modernize it enough that it suits the artist. It's not disingenuous, but it sounds fresh. It sounds alive and interesting. So it's always a quest how to find a sound that's tasteful, but serves the song and doesn't overwhelm it or sound deliberately kind of forced in place. So guys like Victor and Matt and Roger, everybody we've mentioned, they really have that ability to dive into a project and try to understand the artist, what he's trying to do, and find things that are appropriate. So yes, they have the technique, they have the schooling, they have the experience, but at some point you push all that aside and just go, okay, who is this artist? What's he trying to say? And how can I help him bring that out? And those guys, they make your life so easy because they're so good at that.
Oh, they're incredible. I agree entirely. Dan Rothschild for me was like my entry level. I've got to give Dan a shout out.
Mm-hmm. Great player, unbelievable tone. I mean, I started as a bass player, and I just had terrible tone. Just had bad technique. I remember as a kid, one of my favorite bass players in town picked up my bass, which I just thought sounded terrible because I could never get a good sound out of it. He picked it up and started playing, and I was like, Paul, how it's here. It's not the instrument. It's your technique. And Dan,
who played on the Mika record with
you. That's right.
Yeah.
You put any bass in that guy's hand, it sounds so fat.
Yeah.
I don't know how he does it. And his pocket's great, and he's really so serious about how he crafts a part.
His
builds
ear is
it.
insane.
Yeah, well, his dad,
Yeah.
you know,
His dad was Paul Rothschild, who produced those two
who,
records.
who basically lived in this
Mhm.
room, and from what I'm told, was here working on the Janis Joplin album the night that they found out that she overdosed. I think the story is that she was here working,
That's what I
went
heard.
back to the motel, and then they got the call several hours later.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's extra.
Yeah, I'd heard that from Craig as well. But yeah, Dan. The thing, it's interesting with Dan and Sean. It completely changed my life because these guys have such great technique on their right hand that where you're used to with the younger players, like having compression, which is like this.
Right.
It's like because the dynamics are so unbelievable within just maybe an eighth note.
Mm-hmm.
You're watching guys like that, and you're just kind of tapping it because you're right. It's all in their hands.
Yep.
But I think my point, the reason why I was bringing up Dan, he was like the first one of those guys in the 90s that I got to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly I became a better producer and engineer. I suddenly was better.
Exactly.
It's what I'm just reiterating what you're saying.
It's sort of like, it's some people ask me, like, how did you get the White Stripe sound, whatever. It was pretty easy. The two of them have this magical connection. There's this sound that they produce when they're together. And having recorded Jack White with a few other drummers, he could never sound like the White Stripes with anybody but Meg. There's just a simplicity and a bombast and a give and take, a flow with their tempo that it's just this magical combination. And you know how it is. Sometimes you with a band, especially great bands, you listen to the bass, it's okay. Listen to the drums, it's okay. Listen to the guitar, it's okay. You put it all together, it's just like some explosion happens. There's just this connection. It becomes bigger than life. And they have that ability together. So yeah, all of a sudden I'm a better engineer. It's pretty easy.
Well, I would argue, having been in situations with various different bands and stuff, that one of the biggest jobs we have in that situation is to capture it amazingly well, but more importantly, and this is a skill, not to screw it up.
Yes.
Because I think you're underestimating, because there's many situations I've been in where, especially up and coming, I probably completely destroyed it by overthinking it, over EQing. I don't like saying over compressing because that's
whatever.
Badly compressing.
Yes. Right.
But the point is like I probably put too much into it, and there's been situations. I was talking to Shelley Ackers yesterday.
Shelley is my mentor. The reason that I have gigs. Shelley was so kind to me when I was very young, when I was in bands and wanted to start engineering. So the guy that trained Shelley back in Boston trained me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Shelley really gave me my start. He encouraged me. And then years later, when I had moved out here and Shelley moved out here and started up A&M Studios, Shelley brought me in to work with Jimmy Iovine, and I engineered for Jimmy for some years. And Shelley is just beyond. He's in that Glyn Johns, Bob Claremont, and whomever, Lee Massenberg, Al Schmidt, that are just really, really very special and just live on this other level.
Such a sweetheart.
Yeah, a great guy. And his ear, I mean, I just remember, I'll do a really quick Shelley story. So when I first was mixing for Jimmy Iovine, Jimmy would send Shelley in to sort of check the mixes, and your ego is sort of like, oh, I have to have somebody come in and babysit my mix and whatever. So I remember Shelley coming in one time and listened to it. He said, it sounds really good. He said, but that guitar on the right, it's just, I don't know, it's not sitting right. Maybe it's a little scratchy sounding. It just could sit in the mix a little better. Listened again. I was like, yeah, I can kind of hear that. Okay. And he said, I tell you what you do, put that API 550 in. I was okay, and we patched it. And he said, shows it, no, don't use number 3 in the rack. Use number 4. I was like, okay. And put it in, and I started to put the EQ in and twist. He said, no, you don't have to EQ it. Just put it in the circuit. Just push the button in and put it in the circuit. And of course, you know how that stuff works, that it just rounds the top off, rounds the bottom off. And Shelley knew his gear, certainly at A&M, which was his home, and knew every nuance of every piece of gear. He knew that number 4 sounded amazing on guitars, but number 3 sounded great on a kick drum. And you know what? I just put the thing in, no EQ, and all of a sudden it rounded the edge off, put the guitar right in the track, and it was the most subtle move one could make, but it made all the difference in gluing the mix together. And you know, Bob Ludwig is another guy like that. Sometimes I ask Bob what he's done to master my record, and it's nothing. Come on, Bob, nothing. It sounds amazing. What'd you do? Oh, you know, 1 dB at 1K. You know, what do you mean 1 dB? Yeah, I thought it was a little wasn't glued together in the mid range, so I put a dB in at 1.3K. And like the whole mix goes from feeling really loose and untogether to bing. You know, it's guys like that that just have that ability to find the one sort of missing link, the one little piece that puts it together.
Shelley did that with me too.
Really?
So, yeah,
same thing.
Yeah, with a bass sound, because I'd recorded Tom Hamilton's bass, and it sounded great on the roughs. But I couldn't get it on my SSL to sound anywhere like it.
Right.
And he's like, he just looked at me, you know, mentally I could feel him looking at me like, are you not getting this? And because I'd literally done the roughs on an old API with no EQ or anything engaged.
Right.
Just straight off Pro Tools. And he's looking at, you could tell he was kind of looking at me. He was like, what, I would put an API line amp in there and bypass the SSL line amp. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's really freaking obvious, isn't it? Because it was like, all I was doing was like, it's just the sound of, you know, how a bass, you know, it's got that spongy kind of SSL thing, which we love.
Yes.
And you get that spank with the EQ into compression. But whatever I did, I couldn't get that toughness that an API brings.
Right.
I don't know if that's the right word.
No, but it's true. I mean, that's why I love these things. I mean, this console is different than a stock API. Perhaps it's cleaner, a little fatter,
definitely
different kind of tone, but similar family, definitely.
Is there something about this console, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is probably one of the few consoles, and this is a lot of contention, that you can track and mix on?
You know, I've done many albums here where I've done both, and I definitely feel like, you know, other than with the EQs where you're, you know, if you're boosting 3K in on a guitar, let's say, when you come back, your tendency is to boost 3K again, and that never quite sits right. But yeah, I've found I can easily mix and track on the same console, which as a general rule, it's not a good thing. You know, sometimes combination of tracking on a Neve and mixing on an API is amazing, or a Neve and an SSL, fantastic, you know.
It was always traditionally with the Neves, at least when I grew up, is that all those 1272s were fantastic to give you this fatness going in, but the build-up would be too much, which was great to mix on SSL because you could sculpt the mids so nicely.
Yes, exactly.
Which is, but I find my roughs come from here really hard to beat when I go home.
Yep, it's a problem. I all the time. I actually just did something recently where, nope, I just couldn't get it back. And my roughs tend to be flat roughs. I'll put a little bit of stereo bus compression, notch of stereo bus EQ. That's usually it. Maybe some top end on a vocal or on a snare drum, but that's it, you know? Just because I don't want to have to keep chasing them and duplicating them, and I try to just get it to feel great. I mean, I get all my sounds when I'm tracking, and so yeah, theoretically, your roughs should be the same when you go in the box. You know, often I'll move from this room to the back room where I overdub, and it's all in the box with a summing amp and all. Sounds great, it's Burl summing mixer, but it's just never the same. Never the
Right.
same. There's a certain color, and that's the thing that people forget. I'm definitely into using summing mixers, but one thing that all those great records had that we try to emulate is that they were done on analog consoles with many stages of color, many transformers, not only in the console, but transformers on the electronics of the tape machine and then back out of the tape machine, back into the console. So you had stage after stage of amps and
Sure.
transformers that when you record and mix in the box, you're basically one stage here. So you can never quite get that color. And they're two different things. There's nothing wrong with the in the box thing, but to me, it's just a different beast.
Yeah, for me, I'm always looking for ways to advise people. And the first question when somebody asks me about gear, first question I say is, what's your budget?
Yeah.
Because for me, it's like where to put the money.
Right.
Like
exactly.
if you're a beginner, I wouldn't advise starting by buying summing. I'd be like, get yourself a nice mic pre, because
Exactly.
if you're going to record something using one mic pre 40 times, as you just said, you've got 40 instances of all that transformers. Is a far more valuable thing than maybe buying a summer with a pair of transformers in it.
That's right.
And yeah, so it always comes down to me. It's like, where's the budget?
Yeah. I always think put it in to the front end.
Yeah, put
Get
it
a
on the front.
great mic preamp, and then compressor EQ, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is also a significantly cheaper way of doing it, because like a lot of the summing stuff out there is like $4,000 or $5,000.
Yeah,
which is
expensive.
Which is great. And I also think, it's workflow, isn't it? Because the way that we grew up on consoles, it's hard for me to get rid of my SSL, because it's part of who I am and how I work.
The one thing I miss being in the box is, it's funny you're talking about the rough mix thing, is that every time you put up a song on an analog console, even if you, for instance, with your SSL, you do it via Total Recall or Ultimation, whatever you have on your console, you still have all the faders there. I find that I tend to bring the faders up. My balances are always a little different every time I bring the song up, and you discover something new about the song. That, okay, the groove stiffens up when I have the bass just a little hotter, or it's a little bit more interesting in the chorus when I push this guitar versus that guitar. But I find that when I'm in the box and I've got my initial balances, and I go to bring in a song up to do overdubs, well, I've got my balances in there. There's my template for the song, and it doesn't change. And it's sort of, I almost feel like I'm not doing the song justice, that perhaps there's more in there to be gotten out of the song, and I haven't had the opportunity to discover it.
One thing you're touching on there, which I love, and Shelley was talking about as well, is so much in like mixed tutorials and questions I'm always getting asked are about EQ and compression, all this kind of stuff. And I completely understand, because, there's things that we learn coming up, like, we want a kick to be thumpy. Try around 40 to 60 is going to give us some punch. Obvious things, pulling out low mids and drums is nice, opens up. We learn frequency things, and we all kind of do similar things in similar ways. But the one thing about mixing, and not to try and sound esoteric, is what you just touched on, is the relationships between instruments. Because I think a lot of times at the moment, with music being so loud and slamming, is we're all trying to get everything as loud as each other. And great. So we have like every instrument slam, 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 but it can affect that groove and that feel. And Shelley was talking a lot about like exactly what you're talking about. And what you mentioned with you and he, when you're talking about bringing that guitar, just sinking it in lightly, and the feel. So it's a very esoteric kind of subject for when somebody's first starting up, but it's such a big deal.
Yes, it's to me, it's the make or break thing in a mix, and that's why the really great mixers, the Browers and Manny and Elmhurst and a bunch of people that are still working that way, and it's still like grabbing faders and feeling what's exciting here and what locks it in place, and that's the key. It's not the plug-in or the 7 plugins or whatever. It's really like the relationships. Exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of which, though, talking of gear,
Well, yes, it's gear time.
gear time.
Uh-huh.
Now, I was asking you before we started, maybe we could come up with like 3 pieces of very exciting gear that you're loving using. I'll tell you why I thought of it. Because when I'm in the other room, when I'm in 3, and I come in the morning, I've been in here a couple of times. I'm like, what's Joe got these days? And I remember do you have the Shadow Heels up here today?
No, it's in the back room.
Oh, it's in the back room.
Yeah.
So I had been Vintage King lent me a Shadow Heels to try. And I tried it out really briefly and didn't have time to play with it. And I was like, I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know about this. I can't figure it out. And that happens a lot when you don't have the time to study.
Yeah.
And I came in here and I'm like, oh no, I was working in here. It was in here. And I look over there and I'm like, Joe's got the Shadow Heels. And David was also assisting me. He assists you.
Yeah.
And David's like, oh no, Joe loves that thing. Yeah. He makes it sound great. So I went back. I was like, oh, okay. Now I had to work harder on it. Because for me, it was like, well, if Joe's using it, it's got to be good.
Stuff. I do the same if I see somebody who's like, I couldn't get anything out of that. What are they doing?
Yeah, and then you go back and you reevaluate it.
Yeah, it's a great sounding piece of gear. It's been on my mix bus now for last 4 years, maybe something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, it's really great. I mean, I still love the sound of the Smart SSL compressor, but that does a thing where it sometimes softens the mid-range, and sometimes I find that guitars can get pushed too much into the track, and there's a tendency to over-compress with that. The thing about the Shadow Hills, obviously you have an optical and a discrete, and you have to learn to balance those out, not to use too much of one or the other, or perhaps you don't use the optical at all. Sometimes that's not appropriate for a particular song, but it's a great device. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff I'm hooked on, and yeah, like you say, you walk into a room and you see somebody else using that, and you go, oh, I should try that. And I had a similar thing a couple of years ago working at Victor in Drizzo's place. Chris was always using the overstayer saturator on drums and kick and snare. I think he used it on. And I was sort of like, I should try that. Everybody says great things about overstayer, and I should try it. And I've been in the middle of working on a Broken Social Scene album up in Canada. And Niles, the engineer up there, has one, and he uses it on kick and snare all the time. And I fell in love with it up there. It was so appropriate for their music. It's very indie, very tweaky, very destroyed kind of music. And we kind of used it on bass. We've used it on everything, vocals. My favorite thing in here is to use it on the room mics. And I'll put my stereo pair of room mics through it, and you just get that nice fizzy, buzzy distortion that kind of brings a snare to life. And sometimes I'll use it on the individual snare bus, or even maybe on one snare microphone. That's really a great box. The other thing I've been hooked on, I'm not sure who actually turned me on to the Cush Clariphonic EQ to start with, but I'm a real believer in that on the stereo bus. And I use just a taste of it. It's so little, but it just does something to bring a bit more to the mix, a little bit more presence, a little bit more upper and top, a little bit more presence, a little bit more low octave, a little bit more air to the mix. So I'll use that. But about a year or two ago, Gregory came up with this tweaker, which is kind of a distressor. A tweaker. It's kind of I call it a sort of pumped up distressor. So for drums, it can be even more aggressive than a distressor is, and I'll use it as which is pretty aggressive to begin with. Exactly. Yeah. So it does a certain thing where the way he has the VCA in the circuit, you can kind of overload the VCA, like on an SSL console what that sounds like. So if you think about doing that with drums, and then blending that into the compressor, it's a very, very aggressive sound. So I'm hooked on that. I've used it on a bass and acoustic guitar as well, but primarily for a drum parallel compressor. That's pretty great. The other thing I can't live without is my Chandler Curve Bender EQ. That tends to be my stereo bus EQ, and it's usually just a click of it on the top and bottom. It's a very aggressive EQ, but yet can be very broad, and just one notch on the bottom, one notch on the top. It's really great for a mix. It just kind of makes it rock. And I got turned on to it when I was at Blackbird, which if you know Blackbird, you
I've been
know
Blackbird,
that,
yeah.
okay, that John has got everything
you'd ever want,
on
yeah.
the planet, and usually serial number 001 of that particular piece of equipment.
I remember being there as a quick sideline and using a 670, and it didn't feel like it was quite calibrated left or right on the bus. And they're like, hold on, and they just wheel in another one. I'm like, you've got
6 of them, I think, something like that.
Yeah, I was like, so you've got another 670? And they said, well, total stereo mono 660s and 670s. They said, we have 27 channels. I was like, what? I'm sure they have more, because that was like 6 years ago.
It's John.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
John has the original Abbey Road mastering EQs, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s, whatever they were called. And they're in a rack in Studio A there. And I was mixing the White Stripes album, and I don't know, just out of boredom one day, I tried them on the stereo bus, and I was just like amazed. It was very, very aggressive, even more aggressive than the Chandler Curve Bender, and sometimes too aggressive. It can just almost like one notch of it, you're like, that's a little, I love that, but it's a little too much. It pulls my mix apart. So I got hooked on those, but I think there were maybe 12 channels of these ever built. I'm not sure what
by
it was.
the guys at the studio. Yeah.
Exactly. So I went to Wade, because he was coming out with that EQ at the time, and said, I want to try your version. I think Michael Brower had just gotten one, and I forget who else. And I fell in love with it. So that's been on almost every record I've made in the last 10 years now.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a really good box.
Well, thanks for all those tips.
Oh, absolutely.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, I've seen the Overstayer and the Kirsch Curve Bender. There's definitely a lot of the guys I respect.
Yeah.
Rob Snaff had the Overstayer and was freaking out about it.
Yeah. It's pretty great. He's got another box that's, I think it's called an MAS, and it's basically a subtler version of the Saturator. And it's just got a beautiful tone to it. Not as extreme as the Saturator, but really, really almost like a tape saturator in a way.
Fantastic.
Just really juicy. Really beautiful box. Yeah, he's making good gear. Retro is making good gear. His Pultex, the 176 compressor's great. The Gates compressor.
I love the ability to have the sidechain function on it.
Yeah,
That's
always.
huge.
Yeah.
It's subtle though. I did a recall. We didn't quite get it right, and we're like, "Where's the bottom end?" And then we just moved. Oh, there it is. Came back.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you have it on bass or something?
Had it on bass.
Yeah. Right. It'll probably overdo it. I found that sidechain's great for vocals.
Oh, for vocal. I haven't tried vocals.
I'll let 125, 150 cycles go through it, and it just seems like you don't hear the compressor as much, and the vocal still maintains its size, and it'll just get the ugly mid-range peaks to sit nicer.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you ever so much for your time.
My
I really
pleasure.
appreciate
Good
it.
to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
I'll see you in the hallway one day.
See you in the hallway probably in a week.
Oh, good. That's right. Yeah.
Yep, fantastic. Well, marvelous. Thank you ever so much for watching. Of course, please leave a bunch of questions and comments below. Maybe when I bump into Joe next time in the hallway, I'll ask them. So have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Thank you ever so much for watching.